You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. On October 7th, almost 50 years to the day the Yom Kippur War began in October of 1973, the Palestinian group Hamas breached barriers between Gaza and Israel and coordinated a series of attacks on Israeli military targets and civilian communities near the border. It's clear from the recent reporting in Israel that the world is starkly divided on who's responsible for the underlying issues provoking this violence, and how the Western world and Arab world should respond. President Joe Biden has signaled his support of Israel following the attacks, but he warned against Israel conducting a ground offensive and a wider occupation in Gaza. This all comes at a moment when Saudi Arabia and Israel were seeking to broker a deal to normalize tensions. Now the Biden administration faces the possibility of providing munitions and aid in two ongoing wars. What role should the United States play, especially if the conflict escalates in the Middle East and threatens deals already in the making? In mid-October, I spoke with former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. Gates was in San Francisco for the 70th anniversary of the Eisenhower Fellowships. Secretary Gates served in defense and intelligence under 8 presidents, and he became Secretary of Defense during the George W. Bush administration in 2006. He retired from government service in 2011 after being awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama. We talked just after the bombings in Gaza had begun, and Secretary Gates predicted what might come next. Secretary Gates, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you.
We have to begin in Israel and Gaza. The U.S. has a security relationship with Israel, but I bet a lot of Americans don't know what's in it. What does it oblige the two partners to do, and particularly in this case, a non-state actor directly attacking on the national territory of a member of this alliance? What are America's obligations to Israel under the terms of existing agreements?
Well, it's been a while since I was in government and reviewed those agreements, but I think basically the security arrangements we have with Israel commits us to provide military assistance to Israel in the way of equipment. It does not commit us to commit American troops if Israel is attacked. So unlike the NATO alliance, where we have an Article 5 commitment to that an attack on one is an attack on all, and it commits us to commit American troops. We don't have that kind of a commitment with Israel, but we do have a series of agreements that in essence assure Israel of a continued supply of military equipment.
In a bilateral relationship like this, is there a lot of give in the language? Can agreements be read broadly or narrowly?
Yes, but my experience has been, and I go back to, I entered government actually a year before the 1967 war. So I've been through a number of these wars, and although there were some disagreements about timing and so on during the Yom Kippur War, mainly between the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense in the U.S., there really has not been any quibbling over the obligations the United States has had to support Israel.
Israel says it wants to end Hamas, and in the current pressure cooker of everything that's going on there, it's understandable to hear that. Is it doable as a matter of defense strategy and planning?
I think it's a very tall order because they probably have the kind of intelligence that will enable them to target some of the most senior leaders of Hamas over time. Finding them in Gaza could be a real challenge during the current circumstances, but I think getting the top leadership of Hamas is a doable thing. Wiping out Hamas as an organization, I think, is a big challenge and probably would require some prolonged occupation of Gaza itself.
You've been critical of the Biden administration's policies in defense and security matters. There's no secret about that, praising them from time to time, but critical also. How do you think the president has played America's hand in these initial days of the war?
I've said that I thought he's handled the invasion of Ukraine well. probably a little slow on the weapons, but by and large, I give them high marks for how they've dealt with Ukraine. I would do the same with respect to the invasion of Israel. I think the commitment of U.S. military resupply, repositioning the Gerald R. Ford carrier group just as a signal to others, potentially sending a second carrier group, the Eisenhower, to send the same kind of signal, and the level of outrage, moral outrage, has all been entirely appropriate, and I think has given Israel real confidence that the United States has its back.
When you do something like send a carrier group to a place in the world, what is that in practical terms meant to show? Going to the Eastern Mediterranean, just off the coast of Israel, what does that mean in practical terms?
I think as much as anything, it's a signal to particularly the state actors. I would say particularly to Syria and Iran to stay out of this conflict. It's probably a signal to the Russians not to fool around. But I don't see, if there is an attack in the north from Hezbollah, I don't see the U.S. becoming militarily involved. I don't see the carrier strike groups actually attacking targets in Lebanon. So I think they're there primarily to deter and not to become engaged.
That's a lot of hardware to put somewhere almost on a symbolic level.
It's a powerful signal, that's for sure. The other side of that is it's also a powerful signal to the Israelis that we have their back.
It was widely speculated that Prime Minister Netanyahu, to a degree unusual, I think, in the relationship going back all the way to 1948, favored a Trump reelection. When Joe Biden was vice president, Republicans invited Benjamin Netanyahu to speak to the Congress to denounce the JCPOA, the agreement meant to slow Iran's nuclear program. President Biden was critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu's judicial reforms. When the chips are down, you could argue the two countries always support each other. But when there's a difficult relationship or a difficult history between the leaders at the top, can it complicate the work, even with a relationship as old and as close as this one?
Ray, I worked for 8 presidents, and I think the angriest I ever saw, all 8 of them, at one time or another, was with respect to Israel. And whether it was West Bank settlements or frustrations in a peace process or anything. And I'm talking about President Carter, who did the Camp David Accords. I'm talking about First President Bush, who did the Madrid Conference. And it's a relation. It's almost like a family in the sense that the two are very close. And when the chips are down, they're there for each other. But in diplomacy and in kind of day-to-day things, there's a lot of frustrations in the relationship. And maybe it's because there is such a strong foundation of the relationship that they can afford to disagree or bicker when some of these other issues come up. But whether it's the U.S. coming to Israel's assistance in 1973, whether it's now, the United States has always been there for Israel when it counted.
We're not talking about big open fields with 2 sets of cavalry horses going at each other or waves of infantrymen in hand-to-hand combat. And I think it may be part of why the world is holding its breath as Israel gets ready to do whatever it's going to do in the Gaza Strip, contending with an irregular army scattered in a dense urban area, crowded with civilian non-combatants. World bodies are calling for restraint, but the nature of the initial Hamas attack seems to be justifying something much different. What's smart, what's justifiable, and what's legal? And is there a Venn diagram where there's enough overlap between those 3 things that you can get a response out of it that makes sense on all those scores?
I think you have to start where the Israelis start, and I think they have a valid point. It is Hamas that is using innocent Palestinians as human shields. They hide among the civilians, they hide among the schools, they hide in the hospitals. And this makes it infamously difficult when we were trying to figure out what to do about the American hostages in Lebanon. When Hezbollah had seized them in the early 1980s, we looked at target sets all over Lebanon in terms of how to punish those who were holding our hostages. And all of the sites of any consequence were co-located with schools, were co-located with hospitals, and we ended up never using force because of that fact. There are a couple of things that complicate Israel's operations at this point. One is this huge dilemma that they face of the hostages. And my bet, based on our experience with terrorists in Beirut, is that the hostages are widely dispersed and they're probably keeping them on the move, so that it's very hard to pinpoint where any number of them are. So how do you conduct this ground operation while minimizing the potential risk to the hostages? And that's very tough. And it'll be interesting to see how the Israeli government sort of squares that circle in terms of completing what they have said is their objective, which is to eliminate Hamas, and at the same time try and do something about saving the lives of the hostages. It's going to be very, very tough. And I think that they will take whatever measures they can to try and protect innocent civilians. But if you're fighting house to house, building to building, floor by floor in high rises, it's going to be very tough.
There's now a national unity government in Israel, shoring up the existing Netanyahu government. But I wonder if the sense of security that was offered in Israel by Iron Dome, a sort of cornerstone belief in the potency and the exquisite training of the Israeli Defense Forces, by the strength of coordination and intelligence, belief in the Mossad, has been sort of shattered by the last few weeks. If people are asking some uncomfortable questions about the days leading up to the Hamas attack and Israel's slow response once Hamas fighters were on Israeli territory.
Well, first of all, this isn't the first time for the Israeli services to be surprised. Israel was surprised in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War, and we're really in trouble for the first few days. And that was a state-to-state attack. They were being attacked by real armies with lots of artillery and tanks and so on. And they pulled it out in the end, but it was very tough and a near-run thing in many respects. American intelligence failed before 9/11. I think at a certain level, sometimes they've been reading too many novels and watching too many movies and have unrealistic expectations about what intelligence agencies can accomplish. You can get it right most of the time, but if you don't get it right all the time, then you end up with this kind of situation. But there will be an investigation in Israel to figure out what went wrong. My view is that the domestic crisis in Israel distracted a lot of people. The security services were objecting to the moves that Prime Minister Netanyahu was making with respect to the Supreme Court. There were reservists who were refusing to serve that government. So part of it will be that the divisions in Israel and the distraction, frankly, just diminish their ability to see. Now, I've read that the Egyptians warned them several days before that something was coming and that warning was not taken serious. I don't know if that's true or not, but you'll go back, and as we have discovered, there will be lots of signs in retrospect that tell you something is coming, and they'll just have to figure out who to hold accountable. But there's no doubt that it's a serious failure. I think part of the magnitude of Israel's response is going to be to reaffirm or to reestablish deterrence, that the impact of what they are about to do will be so devastating that it will warn others that you may catch us off guard, but you can't destroy us, and the consequences of your actions will be unbelievable. So I think part of whatever they do is to kind of reestablish that reputation, if you will, that has been damaged by the surprise attack.
Does that have embedded in it the potential to have even Israel's friends trying to stay its hand? Are there political problems, not just security ones, that might be in the offing?
Well, I think that, if the past is prologue, you will fairly quickly begin hearing a variety of voices, probably mainly in Europe, calling for a ceasefire, calling for Israel to stop. My own guess would be that the Biden administration will be willing to give the Israelis a lot more time than virtually anybody else. There is a piece of this in terms of regional strategic importance that I think needs to be said, and that is, I think it's important to understand the benefit to Iran of what Hamas has done. First of all, there's no doubt in my mind that the Iranians trained, armed, probably gave strategic and tactical guidance to Hamas. Whether they knew the exact date of the attack or not, I think is kind of immaterial. They had to know that Hamas was preparing this attack and probably helped plan it. I'm going to get a little extended answer here, but the problem with the reconciliation in the Middle East is that the Arab peoples, according to almost all the polls, are far more negative about reconciliation with Israel than their governments are. And overwhelmingly negative. And I think this is probably true even in Saudi Arabia. And I think the longer that operation goes on, the greater the likelihood of mass protests in a lot of Arab cities that will bring pressure on those governments to the degree that the reconciliation between the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and Israel, is delayed or potentially even reversed. That is a strategic victory for Iran. And frankly, I think this war, one of the reasons Iran would welcome what has happened is because of the potential to produce that strategic reversal of a development that was very much against Iran's interests. And the other question is how soon and how strident the demands of Arab governments will be for Israel to stop its operation, as opposed to the Europeans and others.
There were so many things in process before these fighters came running across the border. Mohammed bin Salman was said to be not necessarily ready to kiss and make up with Iran, but there was a rapprochement in the offing, we're told. The Abraham Accords and Israel's new relationships with various Persian Gulf states, even the possibility of a more regular relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Is all of that just swept off the board, put on ice? There's a lot going on there.
Well, I think at a minimum, there will be a pause. And I think the question is, as I was just suggesting, the question is whether it becomes a pause or a reversal. And we don't know the answer to that question. And partly it will depend, I think, on how the operation against Hamas goes.
But some of the resulting problems are a little counterintuitive. Along with the opening channels between Riyadh and Tehran was a closer relationship between Iran and Russia and Saudi Arabia and Russia, Saudi Arabia and China. There were rumblings about a fairly broad-based turning down the heat in the sort of Sunni-Shia rivalry in that big stretch of land that goes all the way from Tehran to the Gaza Strip. A lot going on. Why would this be in Iran's interest? It's kind of hard to figure it out. They were, on some levels, ready to come in from the cold.
Well, I think that the reconciliation between the Arab states, the Sunni Arab states and Israel, did present a long-term strategic threat to Iran. Yes, there was a turning down of the temperature between Tehran and Saudi Arabia, but I think the irony is I think the reconciliation between Israel and Saudi Arabia was far more advanced than any reconciliation, if you will, between Saudi Arabia and Tehran. No, I think the big strategic gain for Iran is disrupting this reconciliation that was going on. And it is complicated. And we end up talking about a almost somewhat different issue strategically when we talk about the relationships with Russia and so on. Biden is the third American president to demonstrate that the United States was pulling back in the Middle East. And guess what? The Arab leaders believed. And so, in my view, they were all hedging their bets about the United States pulling back in terms of being a security guarantor for them against Iran. And so all of them were hedging. So the leaders, over the last 2 years, there have been more visits to Moscow and Beijing by the leaders of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel than there have been to Washington, D.C. So I think that this outreach to Russia and to Beijing has been part of a hedging strategy to keep all the channels open as far as particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but interestingly also Israel.
One fairly sotto voce response came from Vladimir Putin. He didn't seem particularly pressed about the fact that there was now a full-scale war unfolding in between Israel and Hamas.
This Hamas attack is a gift to Vladimir Putin. It distracts the United States from Ukraine. It has the potential to divert military supplies from the United States from going to Ukraine and instead going to Israel. It takes the world's attention off of Ukraine. So I think this is all to the good as far as Vladimir Putin is concerned. The more trouble for the United States and its allies, the better.
But the world doesn't get to handle its problems one at a time. Ukraine is still trying to push Russia out of the land in the east and the south, occupied long before the full-scale invasion, and the Black Sea may be getting militarized. This must be a little disturbing for you to watch.
Well, it's not surprising given the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And again, I think the lack of a U.S. and European, anybody's response to the invasion of Ukraine in 2014 was a heck of a signal to Putin. The Ukrainians in 1994 signed an agreement with the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia that guaranteed their territorial integrity in exchange for them giving up 1,800 nuclear weapons. That agreement didn't do much good for Ukraine. And when Russia violated that agreement, that 1994 agreement, 20 years later, in 2014, the unwillingness of the West to do anything as a consequence, other than a few sanctions, pretty telling in terms of a security assurance to a country.
What was really on the menu, in realistic terms, in 2014 that wasn't tried, wasn't contemplated?
Well, I wasn't in government at the time, so I don't know what all.
But what would be on a possible menu?
You could have imposed the same kind of sanctions in 2014 you imposed in 2022, which were pretty dramatic sanctions at a minimum. But security guarantees to Ukraine, providing military equipment to Ukraine, starting training then of Ukrainian forces. There are a lot of things that could have been done.
The stopgap spending plan that keeps the American government operating in Washington only passed because Ukraine aid funding was taken out to be dealt with sometime in the future. For all Ukraine's success on the battlefield, is this a perilous moment in the diplomatic battle space?
I don't think it's as perilous a moment diplomatically because I don't think much is going on diplomatically with respect to Ukraine. I think it is a perilous moment in terms of Ukraine's confidence that the West will have its back and that the United States will fulfill the commitments that President Biden has made to them to be with them as long as it takes. I think that's his quote. And the inability of our Congress even to elect a Speaker of the House, much less pass a military appropriations bill, which hasn't been done before the start of a fiscal year since 2010, simply signals the paralysis in our own government at a time, I think, of significant international peril.
On that unsettled state of congressional leadership, are defense and national security matters in the modern context so heavily centered in the executive in the U.S. that the president of the day, whoever it is, has a lot of freedom of movement in national security matters, and Joe Biden has time until the GOP figures it out? Or is this a real practical problem for the administration going forward?
When it comes to the movement of forces, the president has a great deal of leeway. But when it comes to money, he has no leeway. And the Pentagon, despite the enormous size of its budget, has extraordinarily little flexibility in how it spends that money. Virtually all of it, except for a tiny, tiny percentage, is specifically allocated to specific tasks. And anytime you want to reprogram any of that money, you have to go to 4 committees of Congress to get approval to reprogram $10 million, $20 million. So within the framework of an already approved budget, congressionally appropriated budget, the president has very, very little flexibility to move money around and to take it from one program and allocate it to another without the consent of Congress. My wager would be that particularly the Ukrainian leaders, both military and civilian, are very nervous about what happens to the pipeline from the United States. The Europeans can make up some of that difference, but not very much, and for not very long. So it really matters to the Ukrainians whether that pipeline from the United States remains open.
And if you're sitting in the Kremlin, is it a worthwhile bet to keep on fighting at least until November of next year to see what happens?
Putin is banking on the fact that he can outlast the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans. And that if he can keep this war going and avoid a major collapse in eastern Ukraine and in southern Ukraine, that the pressures in the West will increase dramatically, both for a negotiated settlement, but also to cut off assistance to Ukraine. And that's what he's counting on. And I think he believes that time is on his side at this point.
Has Russia's failures in Ukraine, they've been there 19 months, made Russia even more dangerous? The joke goes that the invasion has taken the Russian army from being perceived as the second most powerful in the world to the second most powerful in Ukraine. That may be, but does it also carry with it the threat of a more reckless, less constrained Russia?
I think that depends a lot on what happens with respect to the United States and the rest of NATO. As long as we're supporting Ukraine, given the fact that we have strengthened our NATO capabilities in Eastern Europe, in Poland and the Baltic states and elsewhere, with the addition of Finland and potentially Sweden, Russia is in a much weaker strategic position now than it was 2 years ago. And the problem that Putin faces is that his conventional capability has been significantly degraded, particularly if you're contemplating taking an action against a NATO country, which would put you at war with NATO. And the problem that he has is that while he has 1,900 tactical nuclear weapons, the truth is it's hard to find a useful purpose for them that in any way is commensurate with the political price you're going to pay for using them, and potentially the military price. They have a very limited area that they would destroy. You could use several potentially and sort of have a no man's land to parts of Crimea from Ukraine. But on the battlefield, they're a tactical advantage. That's why they're a tactical nuclear weapon. They're not strategic. They're not going to change the outcome of the war. But here you have Putin's closest buddy, Xi Jinping, publicly twice warning him not to use nuclear weapons. And even Putin has kind of backed off of some of his rhetoric in that regard. His deputy national security chairman, Dmitry Medvedev, talks more wildly about using nuclear weapons than almost anybody else. But Putin's been pretty cautious. Because the truth is, if he were to use nuclear weapons, even tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine or any place else for that matter against NATO, that becomes a very different story. But more importantly, I think it creates real problems for China. I think it knocks India off the balance beam. I think India has to react in a very negative way. I think a lot of the global South will react in a very negative way. So countries that have sort of been trying to balance between Russia and the United States and Ukraine, I think would be forced to take a position more hostile to Russia. So the consequences of the one military option that he has beyond where he is in eastern Ukraine, I think in many respects, I won't say it's an unusable one, but the consequences are extraordinary and far outweigh whatever he might gain.
You ask in your recent article in Foreign Affairs, and as an aside to the audience, you should definitely read it. It's called The Dysfunctional Superpower and asks, can a divided America deter China and Russia? The article begins, the United States now confronts graver threats to its security than it has in decades, perhaps ever. Well, that line made me sit up in my chair. More than during the Yom Kippur War, where there was talk of nuclear strikes, they were supposedly seriously on the table. More than during the Cuban Missile Crisis. More than when the global economic order teetered on the verge of collapse 15 years ago. What makes today particularly perilous?
First of all, because you have crises in so many different parts of the world. You have a war in Europe for the first time since 1945. You have now a war in the Middle East. You have Chinese determination to take Taiwan at some point. Xi Jinping has told his army to be ready by 2027. And you have an American government that basically is paralyzed in the face of all of these different kinds of threats. You have North Korea with a nuclear capability, significant nuclear capability at this point, Iran on the threshold of a nuclear capability. What I go ahead and say in the article is we are not far from the point where when China finishes its current deployment of additional strategic nuclear missiles, nuclear-armed missiles, Russia, China, and North Korea together could have a nuclear arsenal twice the size of America's. We haven't faced an aggressive military adversary in both Europe and in Asia since the Korean War. And we have never faced an adversary that is as scientifically, economically, technologically advanced as China. So my talk about the peril was not so much tomorrow as the fact that these things are continuing to develop. And we need to be strengthening our defenses in the United States. We need to be continuing our modernization. And we can't seem to get legislation passed that will enable us to do what we need to do to be prepared to deter these aggressive leaders. The other point I make in the article that I think is relevant to all of this is that Putin and Xi have both already made significant miscalculations that have dramatically hurt their country. Putin by invading Ukraine, Xi by his economic policies and what he has done with respect to both COVID, but also restrictions on private enterprise and business and the state of the Chinese economy. Once you've already made major miscalculations, and when you know that your adversary is surrounded by yes men who are not going to disagree with them, I think the risk is very great.
Secretary Gates, great to talk to you. Thanks a lot for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Adam Ailey, and Andrew Stelzer. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.